The fluorescent lights of Morton's diner hummed their eternal song, casting everything in that particular shade of tired yellow that made even the youngest faces look worn. It was 11:30 on a Thursday morning, that dead space between breakfast rush and lunch crowd, when the place belonged to the regulars and the lonely. Augustus Webb sat in his usual booth by the window, the one with the torn vinyl that nobody bothered to fix because nobody important ever sat there. He was 79 years old, and the scar that ran from his left temple down across his cheek and disappeared beneath his collar looked like lightning frozen in flesh, raised and shiny with a particular texture of old burned tissue. He never tried to hide it. Hiding implied shame, and Augustus Webb had done nothing in his life to be ashamed of. The teenage girl behind the counter glanced at him with that particular expression he'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that mixed pity with discomfort and landed somewhere near disgust. She was new, couldn't have been more than 17, and she whispered something to the cook that made them both look his way before quickly looking away. Augustus had ordered the same thing he always ordered, black coffee and wheat toast dry. The simplicity of old age, when appetite becomes memory and eating becomes maintenance. He'd brought the newspaper, though his eyes weren't what they used to be and reading the small print made his head ache after a while. Mostly he just liked the ritual of it, the unfolding of pages, the sense that he was still part of a world that increasingly treated him like furniture. Two men in business suits occupied the counter seats, their laptops open, their conversation full of numbers that meant money. One of them caught sight of Augustus's reflection in the chrome napkin holder and said something under his breath to his companion. They both turned, openly staring at the scar, and the first man made a face like he'd smelled something rotten. Augustus met their eyes in the chrome's distorted reflection and watched them quickly turn back to their screens. This was the daily choreography of his existence now. The stares, the whispers, the careful avoidance of sitting too close. He'd been coming to Morton's for 3 years, ever since his wife Lorraine passed, and cooking for one person seemed like the saddest thing a man could do. The owner knew his name, the regular waitress sometimes asked about his week, but he understood that this recognition was professional courtesy, not connection. He was the old black man with the terrible scar who sat alone and left exactly 15% tip, no more no less, calculated to the penny on his fixed income. A family came in, mother and father with 2 boys who couldn't have been more than 8 and 10. The younger one saw Augustus and stopped walking, his mouth falling open in that unfiltered way of children before society teaches them to hide their revulsion. "Mommy, that man's face," the boy started, but his mother shushed him quickly, grabbing his hand and steering the family to a booth on the far side of the diner, as far from Augustus as the space allowed. The boy kept turning around to stare, and each time his mother physically turned his head back forward. Augustus watched this happen with the same emotional distance he'd cultivated over decades. Getting angry would change nothing. Expecting different would only lead to disappointment. He'd learned these lessons the hard way, learned them in a country he'd bled for, learned them in the years after he came home when the uniform came off and he was just another black man who made white people nervous. The teenage girl finally brought his coffee and toast, setting them down quickly without making eye contact, her movements efficient and impersonal. "Thank you, sweetheart," Augustus said in his gentle way, his voice still carrying traces of South Carolina despite 60 years in California. She nodded without speaking and hurried back behind the counter. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into joints that ached more with each passing winter. Through the window he could see the parking lot, the gas station across the street, the same view he'd watched gradually change over 3 years of Thursday mornings. A new coffee shop had opened last year, one of those expensive places with leather chairs and names for sizes that made no sense, and he'd considered trying it once but suspected the reception would be the same or worse. At least here they knew him enough to serve him without incident, even if they served him with distance. The thing about a scar this prominent was that people always assumed it defined you. They looked at Augustus Webb and saw only the damaged tissue, never the man beneath it, never the fullness of a life that spanned nearly 8 decades. They didn't know that he'd been a young man once, smooth-faced and strong, didn't know about the girl named Lorraine who'd married him despite her father's objections because she saw something in him that time would prove right. They didn't know about his 43 years working at the post office, the mortgage he'd paid off in 30 years instead of 30, the daughter he'd put through nursing school. They certainly didn't know about the humid morning in 1968 when the world caught fire and he'd run into the flames instead of away from them. The scar was 60 years old, acquired when Augustus was 19, and sometimes when he looked in the mirror he had to remind himself that the young man who'd earned it was still somewhere inside this body that moved slow and hurt most mornings. He lived alone now in a small apartment on Maple Street, 12 blocks from the diner, a distance he could still walk on good days, though lately there were fewer good days. The apartment was clean but sparse, the furniture from another era, everything carrying the particular quality of a space maintained by someone who'd given up on impressing anyone. Pictures of Lorraine covered one wall, a timeline of their life together from young marriage through middle age to the final photo taken 6 months before the cancer took her. She'd loved that scar, traced it with her fingers in the darkness of their bedroom, told him it was proof that heroes were real. "My beautiful man," she used to say, and he believed her because love makes us believe impossible things. Without her, the scar felt different, heavier somehow, like it weighed more when there was no one to tell him it meant something beyond ugliness. Marcus, the day cook at Morton's, a Latino man in his 50s with kind eyes, was the closest thing Augustus had to regular conversation. Marcus would sometimes come out from behind the grill during slow periods, refill Augustus's coffee without being asked, and talk about his own father who'd served in Korea. There was recognition there, veteran to veteran's son, a bridge across difference that others in the diner didn't bother to build. Last week Marcus had asked about the scar, not from morbid curiosity but with genuine respect, and Augustus had told him only that it was from the war. "You were in Vietnam?" Marcus asked, and Augustus nodded, and that was enough. Men who understood military service knew that some stories stayed locked inside the men who lived them, that some truths were too heavy to share over coffee and toast in a dying diner. The two businessmen at the counter were leaving now, packing their laptops and checking their phones with the frantic energy of people who believed their time was more valuable than anyone else's. As they passed Augustus's booth, one of them, the younger one with hair too perfect to be real, made a show of moving to the far side, actually pressing himself against his companion to avoid getting close. "Jesus," the man muttered, loud enough to be heard, "should have a warning before you walk into something like that." His companion laughed, that sharp bark of amusement that comes from cruelty finding its target. Augustus looked up at them, his brown eyes meeting theirs with a steadiness that made the younger man glance away first. There was no point in responding. Men like that had probably never been punched in the face, never learned the lesson that comes from consequences. Augustus had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about responding to every slight. It was about knowing who you were when everyone else had decided who you weren't. The family with the young boys was leaving too, and as they walked past, the older boy, braver than his younger brother, pointed directly at Augustus's face and asked loudly, "Dad, what happened to that old man?" The father didn't answer, just grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him toward the exit with a muttered, "Don't point, that's rude," which of course didn't answer the question at all but did make clear that Augustus was something to be avoided, not acknowledged. The teenage waitress watched this whole choreography of rejection from behind the counter, and Augustus thought he saw something like sympathy cross her young face before she busied herself with wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Sympathy was better than disgust, he supposed, but not by much. Both treated him as less than fully human, just in different ways. He'd first noticed the flyers 3 days ago, posted on the community board near the diner's entrance. Annual Veterans Memorial Ceremony Saturday, November 11th, Riverside Park. Every year they did this, speeches and flags in recognition for those who'd served, and every year Augustus stayed home. The memories came whether he wanted them or not, especially on these quiet Thursday mornings when there was nothing to distract him from the inside of his own head. Augustus had been 18 when he enlisted in 1967, not because of patriotism or politics but because jobs were scarce for young black men in Charleston and the military promised steady pay, 3 meals, and a way out. His mother had cried when he left, held him so tight he could feel her heart beating against his chest, and his father had shaken his hand with a grip that said everything words couldn't. "Be careful, come home, make us proud." The army had sent him to Fort Benning, then to advanced training, then to a jungle so far from home it might as well have been another planet. He'd been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, sent into the Central Highlands where the fighting was constant and the heat made everything harder. He was 19, barely old enough to vote, carrying an M16 and wearing a helmet that never quite fit right, serving in a country that back home still wouldn't let him eat at certain lunch counters. The platoon he'd been assigned to was integrated by then. The military had officially desegregated almost 20 years earlier, but that didn't mean the racism went away. It just went underground, showed up in who got the worst details, who got promoted, whose stories got believed and whose didn't. Augustus learned quickly to keep his head down, do his job better than anyone else, give them no excuse to write him off. His platoon leader was a white lieutenant from Ohio named Henderson, 23 years old and terrified though he tried to hide it. Henderson was green, made mistakes that cost lives in those first months, but he learned because some men rise to the challenge and some get eaten by it. By the time October 1968 rolled around, Henderson trusted Augustus more than he trusted most of his other men, which is why Augustus was walking point the morning everything went to hell. They'd been on patrol near Pleiku, searching for enemy positions in an area where intelligence suggested heavy Viet Cong presence. The morning was already hot at 7 a.m., humidity thick enough to swim through, and Augustus was scanning the jungle with every sense he'd developed over his year in country. He saw the wire a split second before Henderson stepped toward it. Tripwire for a mine or grenade, nearly invisible in the undergrowth, and Augustus didn't think, just acted. He threw himself forward, knocking Henderson aside, and the explosion that should have killed them both caught Augustus on the left side instead. The incendiary device, they found out later it was a homemade napalm trap, splashed liquid fire across his face and shoulder, and the pain was something beyond description, beyond any spectrum of experience a 19-year-old should have to learn. He remembered screaming, remembered Henderson's face above him full of horror and gratitude, remembered hands beating out the flames while someone called for a medevac, and Augustus thought with perfect clarity that he was going to die in this jungle so far from South Carolina that his mother would never even see his grave. But he didn't die. They got him to the field hospital, then to Saigon, then to a burn unit in Japan, and over the months that followed they rebuilt enough of his face that he could function, though they couldn't give him back what the fire had taken. The scar tissue was thick and ropey, pulling at his eye and mouth, and the doctors told him with professional sympathy that this was the best they could do. Henderson came to visit him in the hospital once, right before Augustus was scheduled to ship home, and the lieutenant had tears in his eyes when he thanked Augustus for saving his life. "You're a hero, Webb," Henderson said, and Augustus remembered thinking that heroes were supposed to look different, that heroes weren't supposed to go home with faces that made children cry and adults look away. He'd been awarded the Bronze Star with V for valor, given a Purple Heart, shaken hands with a colonel who praised his courage while barely looking at his face. Then they'd sent him home to a country in the middle of convulsing over a war half the population thought was wrong, where veterans were sometimes spit on in airports, where a young black man with a destroyed face had even fewer opportunities than before. The teenage waitress was approaching his table now, pot of coffee in hand, and Augustus appreciated that she'd gotten over her initial revulsion enough to do refills. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, and he nodded his thanks, watched her pour with hands that shook just slightly. She was nervous around him, not because he'd done anything to warrant it but because his appearance unsettled her and young people hadn't yet learned to hide their reactions. As she walked away, Augustus heard her whisper to Marcus, "Does it hurt him, do you think?" "It looks like it hurts." Marcus said something too quiet for Augustus to hear, but his tone was gentle, corrective, maybe explaining that scars were old pain, not current pain, that the hurt they carried was mostly memory. This was how Augustus had lived for 60 years. Object of speculation, source of discomfort, his humanity always secondary to his appearance. When you told people this was what racism looked like in its everyday form, they didn't believe you. They thought racism was slurs and burning crosses, not a teenager being afraid to pour coffee, not families choosing tables on the far side of the diner, not businessmen making jokes about warnings. But this was exactly what it was. The slow, constant erosion of dignity by 1,000 small cuts. The message repeated until it became background noise that you were less, other, something to be avoided. Here's what almost no one in this diner knew, what no one in this town knew because Augustus didn't talk about it and his medals sat in a box in his closet. Henderson had gone on to have a distinguished military career, rising through the ranks over 30 years, eventually becoming a general officer. They'd exchanged Christmas cards for a while after Vietnam, Henderson always writing personal notes about debt and gratitude, but eventually life moved on and the cards stopped coming. Augustus didn't blame him. Henderson had a wife and kids and a career, had escaped that jungle morning with just a few scars of his own, and Augustus's sacrifice had become a story Henderson probably told but increasingly didn't feel. This was fine. Augustus hadn't saved Henderson's life to create a debt but because it was the right thing to do, because in that moment another human being needed him and he'd acted. If people wanted to remember stories, honor histories not forgotten, preserve moments when ordinary men did extraordinary things because circumstances demanded it, they'd have to look closer than they usually did, see beyond surfaces that made them uncomfortable. Most people never would, and Augustus had made peace with that, or told himself he had during the long nights when peace seemed like a luxury reserved for those who hadn't burned. The door chimed and 3 teenage boys walked in, baggy clothes and backwards caps and that particular energy of young men performing for each other. They were laughing about something on one of their phones, their voices too loud for the space, and when they slid into the booth directly behind Augustus, one of them caught sight of the scar in the mirrored wall across the diner. "Yo, check out Grandpa," the kid said, and his friends turned to look. Augustus kept his eyes on his newspaper, a trick he'd learned decades ago. If you don't acknowledge it, sometimes it goes away. Sometimes. "Damn, that's nasty," another boy said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like somebody tried to melt his face off." The third boy, who seemed slightly older, told them to shut up, but he was laughing when he said it, and they all kept looking, kept making comments just loud enough for Augustus to hear while just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if anyone called them out. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, his expression hardening as he approached the boys' table. "You boys know what you want?" he asked, his tone carrying a warning that the smarter of them might have recognized. They ordered burgers and fries, still snickering, and when Marcus walked away, one of them said, "Why do they even let people who look like that out in public? That's some horror movie shit right there." Augustus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight that settled on him in moments like this. 60 years of this. 60 years of being treated like his trauma was an inconvenience to others, like the sacrifice written on his flesh was somehow an offense to their comfort. He wanted to turn around and tell them everything. About the jungle, about the fire, about Henderson's life that he'd traded part of his face to save. But what good would it do? They were children, ignorant in the way that privilege allows people to remain ignorant, and his words would just be the desperate justifications of an old man trying to convince teenagers that he mattered. The teenage waitress brought their food, and as she set the plates down, one of the boys asked her, "Does that old dude come in here a lot? Because that's gonna mess up my appetite if I have to look at him every time." The girl's face flushed red and she glanced toward Augustus, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to defend someone against customers, especially customers her own age. He's a regular," she said quietly and hurried away. The boys laughed, and one of them took a picture with his phone, probably to post somewhere with a caption about freaky old people. Augustus folded his newspaper slowly, carefully, using the movement to steady his hands. He was 79 years old, had survived war and racism and poverty and the death of everyone he'd loved most, and 3 teenagers in a dying diner could still make him feel small. This was the cruelty of it, not that the hurt ever stopped, but that you never built up enough immunity to stop feeling it. A woman in her 50s sat down at the counter, ordered a salad, and within minutes had noticed Augustus. She whispered something to the teenage waitress while looking directly at him, not even trying to be subtle about it. The waitress whispered back, probably explaining that he was harmless, just an old regular, and the woman nodded but deliberately turned her stool so her back was to Augustus's booth. This was another version of the same rejection. Not hostile, not cruel, just an endless subtle messaging that he was something to be avoided. Marcus came out again, this time walking directly to Augustus's booth, and set down a fresh piece of pie that Augustus hadn't ordered. "Apple, fresh this morning," Marcus said quietly, and his eyes held an apology for all the things he couldn't control, couldn't fix, couldn't make better just by being kind. "On the house." "You don't need to do that, son," Augustus said, but his voice was thick with unexpected emotion. "Small kindnesses hit harder when you were drowning in small cruelties." Marcus just nodded and walked away. And Augustus looked down at the pie, its crust golden and perfect, and felt the weight of every year pressing down on him. Behind him the teenagers were still talking, their conversation bouncing between normal teenage concerns and occasional comments about the zombie grandpa that they thought were hilarious. Augustus picked up his fork and took a bite of the pie, tasting apple and cinnamon and the bitter knowledge that this would be his Thursday morning for however many Thursday mornings he had left. Sitting alone in a diner where people wished he wasn't there, wearing his trauma on the outside where everyone could judge it, carrying stories that would die with him because nobody cared enough to ask. The community board near the entrance still held that flyer for the Veterans Memorial Ceremony, and Augustus could see it from his booth. Saturday, November 11th, Riverside Park, speeches by local officials and military representatives. General William Henderson, formerly Lieutenant Henderson from that morning near Pleiku, was listed as the keynote speaker. Augustus had seen the flyer days ago but hadn't registered the name, hadn't let himself register it because what would be the point? Henderson probably didn't even remember him, and if he did it would just be as a story he told occasionally, the black soldier who'd saved his life that one time. Augustus had looked Henderson up once years ago, found articles about his rise through military ranks, his distinguished service, his retirement as a 4-star general. Henderson had done well for himself, and Augustus was genuinely happy about that. The lieutenant had been a good man who deserved to live, deserved the career he'd built. That the course of their lives had diverged so dramatically afterward, Henderson to heights of success and recognition, Augustus to the post office and a booth in Morton's diner, wasn't Henderson's fault. It was just the way the world worked, the way it had always worked. The bells on the door chimed again, a sound that happened so frequently Augustus had learned to tune it out, but this time the quality of silence that followed made him look up. 3 men in military dress uniforms stood in the entrance, their presence immediately transforming the casual space into something more formal. The man in front wore the 4 stars of a general on his shoulders, his uniform immaculate, his bearing the kind that could only come from decades of command. He was in his 70s, white-haired and distinguished, and he paused just inside the door as his eyes swept the diner in that assessing way military men never quite lose. The 2 officers flanking him were younger, full colonels from their insignia, and all 3 radiated an authority that made the teenage boys stop talking mid-sentence and sit up straighter without knowing why. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, clearly uncertain of protocol when generals walked into diners. "Good morning, sirs," he said, his respect genuine. "Welcome to Morton's." The general smiled warmly and asked if they could get coffee and a table, said they had a few hours before the ceremony at Riverside Park and wanted something more authentic than the hotel restaurant. The teenage waitress scrambled to clear a large booth, her nervous energy obvious as she fumbled with menus. The woman at the counter was staring openly now, impressed by rank and uniforms in a way she hadn't been bothered by an old man's scarred face. Augustus watched all this peripherally, not wanting to stare but unable to help noting the way the general carried himself, the slight limp that suggested old injury, the quiet command that needed no volume to fill a room. The general and his party settled into their booth, and for several minutes there was normal conversation, coffee being poured, orders being taken. Augustus returned to his newspaper, to the sports section he'd already read twice, anything to avoid looking like he was paying attention to events that had nothing to do with him. But then he felt it, the weight of eyes on him, that particular sensation that raises hairs on the back of your neck. He glanced up and found the general looking directly at him, not the quick glance away that most people did but a sustained observation. The general said something to one of his colonels, then stood up from his booth and began walking across the diner. Augustus felt his heart rate increase, that old military instinct to sit straighter, prepare for inspection. The general was coming to his booth. The general was stopping right beside his table. The general was looking down at him with an expression Augustus couldn't quite read. "Excuse me, sir," the general said, and his voice carried the educated polish of East Coast money and good schools. "I don't mean to intrude, but may I ask where you got that scar?" The entire diner had gone quiet, everyone watching now, probably expecting the old man to be reprimanded for something, to be asked to leave for making people uncomfortable. Augustus looked up at this imposing figure, at the stars and ribbons and weight of authority, and felt a tired resignation. Even here, even now, he was going to have to justify his existence, explain his trauma to satisfy someone else's curiosity. "It's from a long time ago," Augustus said quietly. "Vietnam, 1968. The general's expression changed, something shifting behind his eyes. "1968, he repeated. "What unit?" Augustus hesitated, unsure where this was going, but something about the general's intensity demanded truth. "1st Cavalry Division, sir. Near Pleiku." The general went very still, and one of his hands gripped the edge of Augustus's table like he needed support. "October?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "October, early morning patrol?" Augustus felt time collapse, past and present folding into each other. "Yes, sir." The general's breathing had changed, faster now, and when he spoke again his voice carried everything: recognition, memory, gratitude, grief. You knocked me aside. There was a tripwire. You threw yourself forward and took the blast meant for me. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. It was the moment when a story that had lived in two separate lives suddenly connected across 60 years and made everyone in that diner witnesses to something they couldn't understand but could feel. Lieutenant Henderson, Augustus said, and his own voice was shaking now because this was impossible. This didn't happen in real life. People didn't walk into diners and recognize you from the worst day of your youth. I'm Bill Henderson, the general said, and his eyes were bright with emotion. And you're Augustus Webb. I never forgot your name, never forgot your face, though I haven't seen you since Japan, since the hospital. I tried to find you after the war, wrote letters to the address your company had, but they came back undelivered. He was speaking faster now, words pouring out. I've told your story 100 times, taught it at West Point, used you as an example of what real courage looks like. You saved my life, Webb. You gave me everything I've had since that morning. The diner had ceased to exist as anything but audience now. The teenage boys were staring open-mouthed. The woman at the counter had her hand over her heart. Marcus stood frozen with a coffee pot in his hand. The two colonels had stood from their booth and were watching their general with expressions that suggested they'd heard this story before but were witnessing its resolution for the first time. And Augustus sat in his torn vinyl booth with his cold coffee and his newspaper, looking up at a four-star general who was looking at him like he was seeing a ghost, a memory made flesh, a debt 60 years overdue. Sir, you don't need to, Augustus started, but Henderson cut him off. I do need to, the general said firmly. I've needed to for 6 decades. Then General William Henderson, four-star general, retired, keynote speaker at today's Veterans Memorial Ceremony, did something that nobody in Morton's Diner would ever forget. He straightened to full attention, brought his hand to his brow in the crispest salute Augustus had seen since his own discharge, and held it there. The two colonels immediately followed suit, standing at attention in the middle of the diner, saluting a scarred old black man in his 70s who most people in that room had been avoiding looking at 15 minutes earlier. The silence stretched, broken only by someone's quiet sob. The teenage waitress, crying without quite knowing why except that she was witnessing something sacred. Henderson held the salute for a long moment, giving it the weight it deserved, and then slowly, with deliberate reverence, he bowed. Not a slight nod but a full bow, this distinguished general bending at the waist to honor the man who'd given him his life. Augustus felt his eyes burn, felt emotion threatening to overwhelm him, and he tried to stand but his legs wouldn't quite work, so Henderson reached out and gripped his shoulder. Thank you, the general said, his voice thick. Thank you for my life, for my career, for my children and grandchildren who exist because you didn't hesitate. Thank you for carrying that scar, for paying that price. If you knew how many people walked this earth because you were brave at 19 years old. His voice broke and he stopped, overcome, and one of the colonels stepped forward to steady him. Augustus finally managed to stand, his body shaking, and Henderson pulled him into an embrace, this general holding this old veteran while everyone in the diner watched the 60-year circle finally close. When they separated, Henderson kept one hand on Augustus's shoulder, turning to address the room at large, and Augustus understood that what came next was for everyone there, everyone who'd judged, everyone who'd looked away, everyone who'd made the mistake of thinking they knew who he was by looking at his face. And if you're watching this now, understanding how stories like Augustus Webb's deserve to be told, how heroes often carry their courage in scars that others mock, then maybe you'll subscribe to this channel, help us share more stories of dignity restored, of judgments overturned, of truth finally being heard. General Henderson's voice carried the command that had led men into battle and shaped military policy for decades, and when he spoke now everyone in Morton's Diner listened with an attention bordering on reverence. This man, Henderson said, his hand still on Augustus's shoulder, saved my life on October 9, 1968, near Pleiku in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. I was 23 years old, a green lieutenant who thought I knew more than I did, and I was about to step on a tripwire that would have killed me and probably half my platoon. Private Augustus Webb, 19 years old, saw the danger in the split second before disaster and threw his body between me and an incendiary trap that splashed napalm across his face and shoulder. Henderson's voice roughened with emotion. He was burning, screaming, and even while my men beat out the flames he was asking if I was okay, if anyone else was hurt. He spent 9 months in hospitals, endured surgeries I can't imagine, and received the Bronze Star with V and the Purple Heart for valor above and beyond. And then he came home to this country and Henderson stopped, looking around the diner with eyes that saw everything. The teenagers who'd been mocking Augustus, the woman who'd turned her back, the empty seats beside his booth. And apparently you people thought it was acceptable to mock him. The silence was crushing now, heavy with shame. One of the teenage boys had tears running down his face. The woman at the counter was staring at her hands. The teenage waitress was openly crying, her shoulders shaking. Marcus had set down his coffee pot and was standing with his hand over his heart, his own eyes wet. Henderson continued, his voice gentle now but no less forceful. Do you understand what you were looking at? What you were dismissing? This man is a hero in the truest sense of that word. He sacrificed his face, his comfort, his easy existence for the rest of his life so that I could live. So that I could go home to my parents, marry my wife, have my 3 children, serve my country for another 35 years. Everything I've done, everyone I've helped, every policy I've influenced that might have saved lives. None of it happens without Augustus Webb's courage at 19 years old. One of the colonels stepped forward, introducing himself as Colonel Martinez, and he addressed Augustus directly. Sir, General Henderson has told us your story many times during our training. You're part of the curriculum at West Point now, an example of instinctive heroism and selflessness under fire. Young officers study what you did, learn from your example. You may not have thought what you did mattered beyond that one morning, but I can tell you that you've influenced military leadership for 2 generations. The other colonel, a black man named Colonel Thompson, added his own voice, and there was particular weight to his words. Sir, as an African American officer, I need you to know what your service meant. You served in Vietnam during integration, faced racism in uniform while bleeding for your country, came home to a nation that often treated you as less than human. And you bore it all with dignity. You're why men like me believed we could wear this uniform with pride. You paved the way even when nobody thanked you for it. Augustus found his voice, though it shook. I just did what anyone would do, he said, the humble response of men who've never seen their own courage clearly. Henderson shook his head firmly. No, Webb. Not anyone. Most people freeze, most people save themselves, most people don't act when it costs them everything. You did. And I've spent 60 years trying to deserve the life you gave me. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something Augustus couldn't see at first, then held it up. A faded photograph, creased from decades of handling, showing a young Henderson and a young Augustus in hospital in Japan, Henderson's arm around Augustus's bandaged shoulders. I've carried this with me everywhere, Henderson said. Every promotion, every posting, every important moment of my career, you were there. I just wish I'd found you sooner, could have thanked you properly, could have made sure you were taken care of the way you deserved. Augustus felt something breaking open inside him, 60 years of carrying this story alone, of believing it didn't matter, of thinking Henderson had moved on and forgotten. I didn't need thanks, he said, but Henderson interrupted. I know you didn't. That's what makes you extraordinary. But you deserved it anyway. You deserved recognition and gratitude and a nation that honored your sacrifice. Instead you got stares and whispers and people moving away from you like you're something shameful. That's not right. That's never been right. He turned back to the room, his eyes hardening. Every person in here who judged this man, who made him feel less than human, should be ashamed. You looked at a scar and saw ugliness. I look at that scar and see the reason I'm alive. You saw a burden. I see a hero. You saw someone to avoid. I see someone I've wanted to find for 60 years so I could say thank you. The teenage boy who'd been cruelest spoke up suddenly, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Augustus looked at him, this child who'd hurt him without understanding what he was hurting, and felt the anger that might have been there dissolve into something sadder. You didn't know because nobody asked, Augustus said quietly. Nobody ever asks. They just assume, judge, move on. That's what I've learned to expect. Henderson's jaw tightened. That changes today. Right now. You're coming with me to the ceremony, Webb. You're sitting on that stage, you're being recognized properly, and every person in this town is going to know who you are and what you did. Augustus wanted to protest, wanted to say he didn't need ceremonies or recognition, but Henderson wasn't asking. Please, the general added, his formality dropping away to reveal simple human need. Let me do this. Let me finally thank you properly. Let me show people what real heroism looks like. Marcus approached the table, his expression full of emotion, and he addressed Augustus directly. Sir, I want to apologize. I should have. I should have said something every time someone disrespected you. I knew you were military, I saw how you carried yourself, but I didn't defend you the way I should have. I'm sorry. Augustus reached out and gripped Marcus's hand. You showed me kindness, son. That's more than most people do. You didn't owe me anything more than that. But Marcus shook his head. I owed you respect. We all did. And we failed you every Thursday morning for 3 years. The woman at the counter had turned around now, her face streaked with tears. I was afraid, she said to no one in particular. I saw your face and I was afraid and I'm so ashamed. She looked at Augustus directly for the first time. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The teenage waitress came over, her hands twisting in her apron. I thought you were just a scary old man. I didn't know you were. I didn't know. Her youth made her honesty more painful somehow, the way children reveal truths adults try to hide. Every person has a story, Augustus said gently, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. Every scar has a reason. I learned a long time ago that people judge what they see, not what they don't know. That's just human nature. But it shouldn't be, Colonel Thompson said firmly. And especially not when a veteran is involved. Especially not when a black veteran is involved. Sir, you served when the country was still segregated, when wearing the uniform didn't protect you from hatred at home. You bled for people who wouldn't let you drink from their water fountains. That's a particular kind of courage that goes beyond battlefield valor. He looked around the diner. Every person here needs to understand that racism isn't just slurs and violence. It's this, treating a hero like he's invisible, making him feel unwelcome, judging him by his scars instead of his service. That's racism too, and it's been happening to men like him for generations. Henderson pulled out his phone, made a quick call, and Augustus heard him say something about the ceremony, and a special guest, and make room on the stage. When he hung up, he looked at Augustus with determination. The mayor's there, the city council, about 300 veterans and their families. They're all going to hear your story. They're all going to know your name. Augustus felt overwhelmed, the attention suddenly too much after years of invisibility. Bill, sir, I don't need all that. I'm just an old man who did what he had to do a long time ago. Henderson's expression softened. I know you don't need it, Webb, but I do. I need to stand in front of my community and tell them who you are. I need to make sure that for whatever time you have left, you're treated with the honor you deserve. Let me do this, please. The 3 teenage boys approached together, the oldest one speaking for the group. Sir, we were wrong. What we said, how we acted, there's no excuse. We're sorry. Augustus looked at their young faces, saw genuine remorse there, and remembered being 19 and stupid in different ways. You're young, he said. Young people make mistakes. What matters is what you do with the lesson. Don't judge people by what you see on the surface. Ask questions. Show respect. Everyone you meet is carrying something you know nothing about. The boy who'd been crying nodded, wiping his face. We'll remember, sir. I promise we'll remember. Henderson checked his watch. We need to leave for the ceremony in 20 minutes. Webb, I'm not taking no for an answer. You're coming with us, and afterward, you and I are going to have a proper conversation, catch up on 60 years, and figure out how to make your remaining years better than they've been. One of the colonels had already gone to bring their car around. The other was speaking quietly to Marcus about the bill, though Henderson interrupted to say that Augustus's meals at Morton's were covered from now on, permanently, and he'd be setting up an account to ensure it. Marcus protested that it wasn't necessary, but Henderson was insistent. It's the least I can do. The absolute least. Augustus stood there in his worn jacket and simple clothes, surrounded by generals and colonels and the staff and customers of a diner that had never seen him clearly, and felt the weight of 60 years shift slightly. Not disappear, the scar would still be there, the stares would still come from strangers who didn't know, the pain of a lifetime couldn't be erased by one moment of recognition. But something had changed. Someone had seen him. Someone had remembered. Someone had said, in front of witnesses, that his sacrifice mattered. The teenage waitress approached one more time, her voice small. Sir, can I ask, does it hurt? The scar. Augustus touched his face unconsciously, the gesture of decades. Not physically, not anymore. But carrying it, being judged for it, having people treat you like you're something shameful, that hurts every day. She nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't before. I'll never forget this. I'll never forget you." Henderson gestured toward the door, and as Augustus moved to follow, the general did something unexpected. He offered his arm, not as support but as escort, the way one honored guest treats another. Augustus took it, and together they walked toward the exit, the colonels falling in step behind them. As they passed through the diner, every single person stood. The teenagers, the woman at the counter, Marcus and the teenage waitress and the cook in the back who'd come out to watch. They stood in respect, some saluting though they weren't military, some with hands over hearts, all of them bearing witness to a moment that would become the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. The day a general walked into Morton's diner and honored a hero they'd all been too blind to see. And if you're moved by this recognition, by the importance of seeing veterans truly, of honoring the sacrifices written in scars and silence, then show your support. Hit that like button. Let this story reach more people who need to understand that judgment is easy but truth is complicated, that every face tells a story we should respect enough to learn. The ceremony at Riverside Park was everything Augustus had avoided for years. Crowds and cameras and speeches full of patriotic language that sometimes felt hollow to men who'd lived the reality behind the words. But walking onto that stage with General Henderson, flanked by colonels, facing 300 veterans and their families and city officials, Augustus felt something different. Henderson had insisted he sit in the chair of honor, front and center, and when the general took the microphone to begin his keynote address, he deviated from whatever speech he'd prepared. "Before I say anything else," Henderson began, his voice carrying across the park through the sound system, "I need to introduce you to the man sitting beside me. His name is Augustus Webb. He's 79 years old, and 60 years ago this man saved my life at the cost of his own face." For the next 20 minutes, Henderson told the story, the jungle, the tripwire, the fire, the sacrifice. He told it with the detail of someone who'd lived it and the eloquence of someone who'd spent decades teaching others about leadership and courage. He told about Augustus's medals, his recovery, his return to a country that didn't appreciate what he'd given. He told about losing touch, about carrying Augustus's photograph for 6 decades, about walking into a diner this morning and finding the man he'd been searching for. "And do you know what I found?" Henderson asked the crowd, his voice hardening. "I found a hero being mocked by teenagers. I found a man who saved my life being treated like something shameful, like his scar was an offense to people's comfort. I found that we, as a society, had failed him so completely that he'd learned to expect disrespect as normal." The crowd was silent, uncomfortable, confronted with truth that implicated them all. How many veterans are sitting in diners right now, carrying scars we judge instead of honor? Henderson continued. How many elderly black men and women served this country and came home to racism and indifference? How many heroes are invisible to us because we're too comfortable with our assumptions to ask questions? He gestured to Augustus. This man didn't come to the ceremony today because he's learned that recognition is usually empty. He's learned that people see his trauma as ugliness, not sacrifice. He's learned that being black and scarred and old means being invisible. And that's on all of us. That's on a society that lets veterans slip through the cracks, that lets racism hide in politeness, that values appearance over substance. The mayor stood and began clapping, and the applause spread through the crowd like wildfire, 300 people rising to their feet, the sound rolling across the park. Augustus sat still, overwhelmed, as Henderson helped him stand and the ovation continued, people crying openly, veterans saluting, children asking their parents what was happening and being told about heroes and sacrifice and doing the right thing. Henderson leaned close and said something only Augustus could hear, "You deserved this 60 years ago. Better late than never." When the applause finally died down, Henderson invited Augustus to say a few words, but Augustus shook his head. "I'm not much for speeches, Bill," he said quietly, using the general's first name now because 60 years and a morning in Vietnam earned that right. "But thank you. For remembering. For finding me. For making sure people knew." After the ceremony, people lined up to shake Augustus's hand, to thank him, to apologize for times they'd seen veterans and not really seen them. An elderly white man in a wheelchair, himself a Vietnam veteran, gripped Augustus's hand with both of his own and said, "Brother, I know what you came home to. I know it was worse for you than for me. Thank you for serving anyway." A young black woman introduced herself as an army sergeant, told Augustus that she'd joined because of men like him who'd served when it cost them everything. "You're why I believed I belonged in uniform, sir. You and men like you made it possible." Parents brought their children over, teaching them on the spot about respect and sacrifice and not judging by appearance. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, looked up at Augustus with wide eyes and said, "You're very brave," and Augustus felt his throat close with emotion because children see clearly when adults have taught them well. Henderson pulled Augustus aside eventually, away from the crowd, and they stood together under an oak tree while colonels ran interference to give them privacy. "I need to know you're okay," Henderson said. "Financially, health-wise, everything. I have resources. Let me help." Augustus appreciated the offer but shook his head. "I'm fine, Bill. I have my pension, my social security, enough to get by. I don't need charity." Henderson's expression was pained. "It's not charity, Webb. It's debt. It's me trying to balance scales that have been tilted wrong for 60 years. They talked for an hour, catching up on lives that had diverged so dramatically, and Augustus told Henderson about Lorraine, about their daughter who lived in Oregon, about 43 years at the post office and a simple life lived with dignity despite everything. Henderson told Augustus about his family, his career, the ways that mourning in Vietnam had shaped every decision he'd made since. "I tried to be worthy of the life you gave me," Henderson said. "I hope I succeeded at least partially." They exchanged phone numbers, made promises to stay in touch that both of them meant this time, and Henderson insisted that Augustus come to visit him and his wife in Virginia, meet the family that existed because of his sacrifice. "They should know you," Henderson said firmly. "My children and grandchildren should know the man who made their existence possible." As they parted, Henderson pulled Augustus into another embrace, and this time there were no cameras, no audience, just two old men who'd been young together in hell and had somehow both survived to find each other again. "Thank you," Henderson whispered one more time. "Thank you for everything." The drive back to his apartment felt surreal, the city looking different somehow though nothing had physically changed. Augustus sat in his small living room surrounded by pictures of Lorraine and thought about the strange way life worked, how you could spend 60 years invisible and then suddenly be seen, how recognition could come so late it felt like a dream. His phone rang, his daughter calling from Oregon, somehow having already heard about the ceremony through social media or news coverage, and she was crying as she told him how proud she was, how she'd always known he was a hero even when the world didn't. "Dad, promise me you'll tell me the whole story," she said. "Really tell me, not the abbreviated version you've always given. I want to know everything." And Augustus promised, understanding that some stories needed to be told not for glory but for memory, so that the next generation understood what their parents and grandparents had endured and overcome. That night, lying in bed, Augustus touched his scar the way he had for 60 years, but the gesture felt different now. Not shame or resignation but acknowledgement of something that had cost him dearly but had meaning beyond the pain. Henderson had seen the scar and remembered the man. Others had seen the scar and learned to look deeper. Maybe that was the lesson, not that surface wounds didn't matter, but that beneath every mark was a human being with a story worth knowing. He thought about the teenagers at the diner, about the woman at the counter, about the teenage waitress who'd been afraid of him. They'd all learned something today about judgment and truth, about the gap between what we see and what's actually there. Augustus hoped they'd remember, hoped they'd carry that lesson forward, hoped the next veteran or elderly person or scarred stranger they encountered would be treated differently because they'd witnessed one old man's moment of recognition. The world hadn't changed overnight, racism and ageism and casual cruelty would still exist tomorrow, but maybe 300 people at a ceremony and a handful at a diner would think twice before judging, would pause before dismissing, would remember that everyone carries stories invisible to casual glance. Augustus had spent 60 years believing his sacrifice didn't matter beyond that one morning, but Henderson had shown him differently. Every life Henderson had touched, every officer he'd trained, every policy he'd influenced, all of it rippled out from a decision Augustus had made at 19 without thinking, just acting because it was right. That was the thing about heroism. It wasn't about seeking glory but about doing what needed doing when circumstances demanded it. Augustus had done that, had paid the price, and maybe, finally, the recognition he'd never sought had found him anyway. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt Lorraine's presence like she was lying beside him again, and he could almost hear her voice saying what she'd always said, "My beautiful man, my hero, my Augustus." And for the first time in the years since she'd passed, he let himself believe it might be true. If this story moved you, if Augustus Webb's dignity and Henderson's gratitude resonated, if you understand now how many veterans and elderly people carry histories we never bother to learn, Then share your own stories in the comments below. Tell us about the veterans in your life, about the moments when you realized you judged too quickly, about the time someone was finally seen and honored as they deserved. Let this be more than one man's story. Let it be a reminder that respect costs nothing but means everything, that every scar has a history, and that the heroes among us often go unrecognized until someone takes the time to really see them. Share your experiences, honor your own veterans, and help us build a community that values stories over surfaces, substance over appearance, and the complicated humanity we all carry beneath whatever marks the world has left on us.